Okay, now moving on to our second presentation for today, Dougall McBurnie, founder and managing director of Versa and chief digital officer of Fujitsu. Dougall is a highly successful executive with a strong record of shaping, leading, and delivering transformational change for organizations and a proven ability in establishing startup organizations. As a CEO of Versa, he has built one of Australia's leading data analytics consulting companies from one employee to a team of over 75, which was recently acquired by Fujitsu in 2021. As we heard from Shara about the importance of being a data-driven organization, Dougall will now discuss the role of data analytics and AI platforms to enable sustainability objectives and improve business performance. Come on down, Dougall.
And make sure everyone can hear me all right. All right, everyone can see the sharing. I'll just share that. Okay, we are technically enabled. Everyone can see the presentation, Damien?
Good to go.
All right, fantastic. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And as Damien said, my name's Dougall McBurnie. I'm the CEO and Chief Digital Officer of Fujitsu Oceania. And as part of an acquisition from April, we joined Fujitsu. And today I'm going to talk about data analytics and AI platforms and organizational capabilities and kind of how all three of them come together to create sustainability for business performance and all aspects around that. There's obviously a range of slides, and there's we can, if there's any questions throughout the presentation, just put them into the chat window, and we'll have time at the end to run through them as well. I'll also send out a series of links at the end of the presentation to a number of relevant kind of case studies for everyone on the call. So I'll just a quick agenda. So I'll give you a bit of background about Versa, just so that you understand the sort of breadth of the work that we've done that gives context to our experience in talking about this in detail. I think that the adoption of digital technologies and digitalization more broadly is accelerated far and away faster than any time in history. And there's some very interesting data points there, and it has implications for everyone on the call. We have, I think it's also important to understand why these things fail, and then ultimately work through prioritization, culture, and a capability model to have a conversation on. So just a bit of context about Versa. We are a data analytics specialist. This is what we do. We have a very clear purpose. We shaped this about 4 years ago, 3 years into this organization, and what it did do was it pivoted the company dramatically in terms of the scale of what we do, and ultimately, having worked as a CIO before, we deliver what we promise, and our purpose is to help everyone on the call and all of our customers accelerate the use of data analytics to create value. Because ultimately, if we're not creating value, then we're just building something flashy, and we're not really taking the organization forward. And again, I think it's been a constant theme, I'm sure, through the presentations over the last couple of days, but also throughout everyone's career in ICT. It's value creation that then kind of unlocks value and creates further momentum and capability. In terms of scale, we're now about 85 people. We're spread across Sydney, Brisbane, Canberra, Melbourne, Auckland, and Wellington. And hopefully, once the Western Australian borders open up later in the year, we can expand west as well. And we have one of Microsoft's leading data and analytics partners, one of AWS's as well, and Australia's only DPP partner of Databricks. So we're a huge partner of them. And just to give you a sense of industry, everyone has data issues. So what we talk about today has the context around applicability across whether you're a government entity, whether you're in kind of B2C entertainment, mining, utilities, manufacturing, education, health, retail, finance. Everyone has challenges around data, and everyone has value on the table around it. And I think the kind of core principles of what we're going to talk about are applicable, right across the board there. So let's kind of launch into it. And, I think the key change, through the global pandemic, and this is a study from McKinsey, and it's available on the website, which is, right across the world, and you would have seen it firsthand, the pace of digitization has, effectively accelerated to compress 10 years worth of growth in 2 years. And you can see that in every one of these charts, whether it's the global average there, Asia Pacific, Europe, or North America. And whenever you talk about digitization, data is always central to that conversation, because without data, what are you understanding and how you're driving your digitization, whether it's digitization of front office services, customer product offering, back office services, mining operations, manufacturing operations. Data is central to that. And if the accelerated adoption must be producing huge value, huge quantities of data. And I think the challenge here is ultimately, how to unlock the value of all of that data being created. And I think that feeds directly into, the next slide we got next to talk about, which is really the growth of IoT, which has been a topic, over the last couple of years for sure, around, everyone having sensors right across the, let's say, industrial kind of 4.0 world as well as B2C. But if you just look at the scale of investment, growing 300% from 465 billion to nearly 1.5 trillion. Organizations are not investing in it just because it's cool. They're investing in it because it's transforming the way they're delivering services, the way they're digitizing their organization, the way they're building kind of a digital backbone and changing the quality and appropriateness of, what they deliver for their customers, their citizens, and if they're a B2B organization. So whether it's a water utility installing sensors across their network to, keep the water assets protected and the flow of water, that critical service, whether it's a manufacturing and mining organization doing IoT sensors, or whether it's actually using those sensors in a digital twin model, to optimize their organization, it's all driving data, right? And it's accelerating at pace. So the question is, what's the role of ICT about how to help the organization get the most out of these investments with the data, and not just build a phenomenal platform that's well architected, that has best in class engineering, but actually unlocks true business value, whether that's commercial value in a commercial kind of construct, or whether that's social and citizen value in a government context. So, this is the really important part of what we're going to focus on. And I think it sort of segments well into, why things fail. And this is a stat from Gartner, 85% of data analytics and AI projects are failing. I mean, that's a huge percentage. And you've got to ask, why is it such a large percentage, across the globe? And I think the first and foremost, and a lot of this, everyone on the call has been in ICT for a fair while, I'm sure, and has a lot of experience. And a lot of these are pretty obvious kind of basics that, again, it's good to kind of refresh on, which is, the technology function sometimes leans into running these data projects because obviously, they have such an affinity to the data, but ultimately it is a business-led initiative, not a tech-led initiative. And you've got to really focus on it. It's one of the number one reasons why they failed, because ultimately if there's not the ownership in the business, you're not going to be able to adopt and embed and create new ways operationally of using these platforms. And we'll end up where, we had a great data warehouse no one could use again. Okay, so number one thing that we see. And I think that kind of, ladders into number two, which is, IT doesn't own benefits, right? Business own benefits. So if it's revenue increase, cost reduction, share of wallet, the stakeholders who are standing next to you at the board for, asking for funding for these initiatives need to be there with you hand in glove and really have that deep buy-in around the benefits. Because ultimately, if you can get strong benefits around it and strong ownership, you'll yield those benefits, will create further investment, and that'll create a flywheel of momentum for the organization. There are really kind of well-established, blueprints to leverage in this space. I mean, we've been building cloud platforms now for, a good 4 or 5 years. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? There are very clear architectural blueprints that enable you to importantly deliver value incrementally rather than wait, for a 2-year build. The world that we previously lived in, 5-10 years ago, where, there's an 18-month build before we see an outcome, I mean, the business cycles are so short now, especially accelerating further with COVID, that they need to see something. So, the business case, how does it unlock value in 6 months? How does it show some tangible change to business in that period? And then how does it do it incrementally, right? And I think that that's a great opportunity, again, in terms of how you design these programs. So why they fail, they try to do too much, in either in a short period of time and fail, or they have such a long runway that the business ultimately takes a very tactical approach to it because they can't wait. And there's a range of areas there as well. And I think I can read them through. You can read through them yourself. If you look at the poll on the right, and again, this was a Japanese community session I did about 6 months ago, just asking people, do you believe your organization has the plans, skills, and capabilities to truly kind of unlock the value of data and AI? And, nearly half of them are not confident about it. And I think that that's one of the roles here of, the leadership of ICT, is helping the business understand what capabilities actually are required, and not going into these projects and transformational changes, with I suppose a narrow view of how prepared they are. Okay. And they need to acknowledge that there's a lot of change required on the business side, because ultimately there's so much capability that needs to be built as part of it. So it's a very, very important lesson that we see. Again, a bit of stating the obvious here, but it's worthwhile to kind of cover it again. ICT over the journey has kind of led into a range of projects where there's been kind of gaps in the business, but prioritization has been one that we've come in and out of. And I think in this sort of context, the business have the revenue targets. The majority of spending companies not is in ICT. The business units accountable for benefits, and what we as functions are generally accountable for are architecture, security, and engineering. And as that holds true, then there needs to be a framework around an optimized kind of investment area, so that as use cases come up for data and AI, the business are prioritizing them, the business based on value, based on alignment to strategy, right? And then ICT functions about execution of that in an incredibly kind of lean and efficient and focused manner based on platforms that are highly scalable. But if the business doesn't want to lead into prioritization and ICT fill the gap, that creates a range of issues that leads to kind of potential failure and conflict, because you can also get a lot of shadow IT as part of this. But that doesn't mean that ICT is not part of the prioritization conversation, right? Because there's all sorts of platform and data and implications around this. But at the end of the day, the business product owners appointed to it need to make the calls around what is the most important initiatives to get out the door, what is going to help us hit the revenue targets, our commitments to market over the next six months, 12 months. I need to do something now. I can't wait 18 months. And that prioritization process is important. And for large organizations where you've got lots of divisions, that investment framework helps you prioritize investments across divisions. So again, we may have seen organizations that had 4 different functions, and you prioritize within the functions, but they're kind of silos, right? And you don't want duplication. So you want to have an enterprise approach to it. And I'm sure, this optimizes the spend, it optimizes the effort, minimizes tech debt and rework. So, it's a really important conversation with the ExCo about why this is important and their role in facilitating and driving that. And obviously, in the world we live in, data governance and security and architecture obviously feed into that prioritization process. And I think that prioritization is a business role that we need to stay very focused on. So if we think about why, so the world is accelerating rapidly. We've obviously got more data created every year than any other previous groupings of years together. You understand why things are failing, and now we're talking about business ownership, really clear ownership of it, because that ownership drives prioritization. It's the culture of the organization. How do you actually move to a data-centric culture? And it's easier said than done, obviously. And the leading organizations, the organizations you look to that are constantly in the press about how they're transforming, offerings to market for customers, or the way they're working on data, are the people that have really embedded a really strong culture around data and creating value from data. So there's kind of two aspects to that. And let's go back. And so I think that there's a couple of data points here that again kind of sound obvious, but it's our role to help the organization understand this, which is, it's great to have a single source of truth. I mean, that's only one part of it, and having really well-defined metrics. But ultimately, unless the ownership of the exco and management exists, then it's a platform that will be underutilized in terms of how value is created from it. And we have a number of organisations we work with, but one that comes to mind is the Australian Venue Company, that they have a pub network of about 200 hotels across Australia and New Zealand. And they do have a single source of truth, and they do have well-defined metrics. But importantly, the CEO looks at effectively the business operations dashboards every morning at 7 a.m. and runs through it, and then starts to make kind of calls across the country through area managers, state managers, and regional managers, and through the venues. So everyone through the layers of the organization understands the value of data and how that data is being used to run the company. And therefore, that ownership means that everyone in the company uses that data, and they have a culture of making sure that the data is correct. And they're obviously using that data to make choices every single day, because they understand the executive look at it every day, and they use that to make investment decisions. So it's a really simple example of the power of that buy-in that really starts to generate that culture of data and the culture of kind of creating value from data. And the inverse of that is obviously, silos of capability and really poorly defined data and metrics. Lots of versions of the truth, really hamper organizations' abilities to unlock the value of that data. And you would have seen it time and time again. Someone brings an Excel report to a meeting, and they compare it to a report out of a system or a dashboard, and so surprise, surprise, there's numbers that differ. So the meeting ultimately doesn't drive any value out of the data and make decisions to move the organization forward. There's actually a lot of conjecture about, well, what number is the right number? And then there's follow-up kind of discussions. So, that's why single source of truth, well-defined metrics that everyone buys into, removes that time ineffectiveness across organizations and removes the silos, right? And I think as the role of data is right across organizations, and in fact, data skills and digital skills are largely now, universally across organizations, not just in pockets, and especially around IT. I think clarity of roles and responsibilities enables frictionless collaboration and capability build. So you're not trying to build, competing silos of capability. You're making conscious choices at various points in time about who and where capability needs to sit to drive the organization's use of data forward, okay? And making clear choices around that means that you get that frictionless collaboration, which means that you can accelerate the way you work and the way you deliver. As soon as you've got a lack of clarity and multiple areas of capabilities and, kind of a mixed responsibilities or unclear responsibilities, again, all it creates is, kind of contention and potential confusion, and that decelerates your ability to create value of it, right? Certainly, and the next point is, how visible should data be? If we go back 20 years and maybe even 10 years, the finance team would have a certain element of data. The state manager would have their data, the area manager would have their data, the site would have their data. And everyone had a piece of the puzzle, and very few would have the full view. So they don't understand how well, as an individual, they're performing compared to other areas. And there's a lot of research by MIT, and it's called Working Smarter, and you can Google it, MIT Sloan, MIT CISR, Working Smarter. And it talks about the power of having visibility of data across the layers of the organization. So through visibility, people understand relative performance, but it also then it reinforces this culture of data. And also, if you've got data qualities, it's the fastest way to actually improve it rather than having a project that just specifically fixes it. Because as soon as people understand the data is being used, understand it's visible, you're creating an organizational approach and a culture around using that data, people will enter the data correctly into core systems and they will treat it with respect. And I think the last item here around, a federated operating model, for data and AI, how do you create a model where all of that subject matter expertise that exists in all of the business units, all the technical expertise that exists in ICT functions, how does that come together, to enable, really rapid delivery of value? And everyone's probably delivering via kind of agile paradigms. So you've got the mechanism of, of a hybrid, a cross-functional team to do it. And these cross-functional teams can start the projects, but ultimately then how do the business unit, how does the sales team start to have analysts in their team to do self-service analytics and build models within a framework that, is sustainable and secure? Because certainly what we've seen over the years is, one team just can't do it all. Like we've all had reporting. I was a CIO, and in previous lives, everyone has a reporting team at some point in their life, and the reporting team never has enough resource because ultimately they can get more and more orders to do reporting. So how do you flip that round into this federated model to empower the business units to interact and create value of their data, make better decisions every single day, embedded into ways of working, embedded into their marketing plans, and ultimately you create this huge capability right across the organization, leverage every person's asset and experience to unlock that value, rather than be dependent upon a centralized function of a few that can never truly scale, all right? And if it's the responsibility of someone, it ultimately means the business doesn't have the level of ownership that you truly need. And the relevant case studies here that we talked about. So I'll send out the slow management review and the scissor review. There's a data governance blog that we've written that talks about this as well. And there's a webinar that we did with City West Water about how we created effectively an advanced data platform solution with these kind of federated operating models. So again, I think it's an important aspect of this conversation about how does everyone in the organization play the role with their skill set so that it becomes effectively just the way you do it inside the organization around data and AI. And as an example here, what does a hub and spoke look like, or a core and edge model? You've got to make choices around architecture and engineering, data science and analytics, ways of working, obviously people and capabilities and governance and security and standards. And you've got to have all of those in place. And it's like foundations of a house. You can't just have one corner of the house have a capability and the others not, or else the house is uneven. You need to have these capabilities and build it in lockstep, so they build kind of largely in sync over time. Then, as we've talked about, there's really one centralized team can't do it. It has a constraint on how much value they can deliver. So, you need this federated model. And I think the other issue about centralized teams that I'm sure we've all experienced is because they're resource constrained, and what happens is shadow IT starts to form and builds assets and data assets. And if you've ever had to bring those assets in from the business units, they've been very focused about the value they've created, but ultimately there's been the challenges around architecture, design, engineering, because again, it's kind of not necessarily their skill set. So, and you've got the SMEs that obviously have the knowledge. So if you look at that current state, then back to what I was talking on the previous slide, that federated model to leverage all the skills, and they importantly enable scalability, through minimizing kind of constraints in various teams and bottlenecks. And by having it as a broad-based capability, it becomes the culture of the organization to use data and to build analysis capabilities in business units that ultimately they can move it at a faster or slower speed, depending on what's happening in that business unit. But they'll be inherently focused on creating value. And then the central functions are there to handle highly complex roles, that could occur at the edge, but also to continue to build the core so that you can accelerate faster. So where previously we would talk about building platforms and enabling use cases, if I go back 5 years, it might have been a 12-month build. I mean, these things happen now in 12 and 14 weeks. So you've got to break things down into sprint plans so that you can continue to see value being kind of created for organizations. And as I said, if you get that operating model really well established around the federated operating model, the right platform and architectures and practices and education, then you've actually got all of the business units delivering at that level of velocity. That unlocks a huge amount of value for the organization. But depending on your maturity, depending on the sort of organization you are, how you've invested in this, you will make choices about, does all the capability need to be, if I'm standing up this capability initiative, should I have it all centralized? Should I have it in a team just to start, just to build, make sure all my foundations are in place? But again, it's not ICT doing that in isolation. You're bringing in subject matter experts from the business units as a cross-functional team to build your core capability. And then you're starting to break that out into that kind of federated operating model, by the various hubs. But you're going to make different choices, okay, depending where you're at in the overall kind of journey around, said data and AI, and building, an organizational capability to interact with vast amount of your data to make better decisions faster. If there's one thing COVID has kind of reinforced to every organization, it's how quickly can I respond to external factors to make a better decision based on the data that I've got. It doesn't mean that the data needs to be perfect, and it doesn't mean that the decision, obviously, ideally was going to be perfect. It's all about how do I make better decisions faster and make it on a platform so that the organization understands what those decisions are, so that you keep alignment across the organization so you're not making decisions that are counter to each other. And they're the things that we've certainly learned and experienced over the last 4 years, and it's continuing at speed in what we've got at the moment. So with that said, I've got 5 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's any questions.
Thank you for that, Dougal. Questions from the audience. With the federated model, where do you start?
So I would start if you don't have capability. So if you're starting from a low base, then I think what you've got to understand is where in the organization will you create the most amount of value with using data in a short period of time. So who has the greatest need? Take that area, engage with the executive of that area, understand the people that know the data really well and understand how that business unit works, bring them into a centralized team as a cross-functional team and create value that way, right? And then once they're up to speed with how to interact with these sorts of platforms, capabilities, data models, tool sets, then they can kind of go back to home base, and suddenly you've already got one spoke in a federated model up and running, and then kind of sequence out from that. But you start with the people that are passionate about it, that are engaged about it, that have a value opportunity, okay? Because again, if someone's keen to do it, but there's no value with it, then why would the organization make that investment to create that capability in that particular area as the most important?
Thank you. Who are the industry leaders in your view, and what were their key lessons learned during transformations?
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I think Newcrest Mining is definitely one of the leaders in the mining industry, and they've worked incredibly hard around creating this foundational capability, and there's a webinar on our website around it about how they have engaged the sites and the structures that they've put in place to make sure that the sites or the operations are fully engaged in these data initiatives, that they own the benefits, the safety benefits, the operational benefits, the downtime, the reduction of downtime, maintenance benefits, and then there's a whole education piece, for those organizations, for the end users, about how they actually use these new assets they're creating, these new data assets. And so what they're now in kind of wave 3 or 4 of that, where, it's kind of enterprise self-service advanced analytics, and it's incredibly transformational. And so I think that they're certainly one of the real standouts, that we've worked with over, the last 3 or 4 years.
Great. Another question from the audience. I have a lot of shadow IT. In my organization that comes up with data. Is this a good thing or bad thing? What should I do with this?
Look, I think it's a good thing. It doesn't sound like it at the time, I'm sure, having dealt with it myself, but it is a good thing, because what it says is there is demand in your organization to actively use data to drive the business units. So then I think the conversation is, it's not about how do you bring all that shadow IT into central, which is the kind of old argument going back 10 years. It's actually saying, what are they doing? And is it the right use of their time to have business units doing architecture and engineering, or is a better approach to have a cross-functional team where we're working together to build platforms so that the organization makes singular investments that get reused? Most accountants like to hear that, right? An operating model that means that your business unit is unconstrained, so it's not like a previous worlds of 5-10 years ago. And then you start to talk to the benefits of what that's going to drive for the organization. Consistency of models, visibility of data, optimization of scarce resource. I mean, we haven't had skilled migration in Australia for the last 18 months, 2 years, right? It's creating a skills crunch. So everyone is asking, how do I make sure I have the people that I do have spend the most amount of time on the things that matter? And you'd ask the question, building platforms in lots of different shadow IT areas, is that a good idea? Or building dashboards in Power BI as an example. Look, if they're building dashboards on endorsed gold class single source of truth data models, then that's great. That means you've actually got a federated model, right? They're unencumbered building. That's kind of really where you're trying to get to. But if everyone's got their own models, then that's obviously well and truly a fair way from where you need to get to, because, as I said, these create long-term issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dougall, for your presentation and your thoughts as well. Appreciated.
No worries at all. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.